Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This episode 4, Unbreakable Bonds, or the proto-Metaphor. This is the third um, extension of the idea, the metaphor, the operation of the metaphor. I've talked about the metaphor as a natural thing, as an artificial thing, and now I'm going to talk about it as a kind of social, cultural thing. So we've talked briefly about the idea of the operation of the metaphor as a kind of like generative strategy, something that's kind of like an analog in nature, and it's an extension of natural processes. We talked about the fact that the accretion that we see of things coming as a result of the combination of other things was something that we understand as a process that kind of takes us from simple things up to complex things and exist in the kind of natural world, or is kind of like, the world, the natural has a natural selective process. In fact, selection is itself an extension of that same metaphorical operation. So that was the first one. And then we talked about the second one, which was like the situation where we talked about it in the natural world. We talked about how certain things came about, and we talked about a critique of Chomsky, Bright Bernowski, and the ideas of Whitehead in terms of the idea of a process that kind of comes about in producing useful things. And we talked about an example of useful thing is not something that necessarily can be proven or exist uh, with complete clarity, but basically has a kind of consequence or usefulness like a map, something that basically allows you to be able to use it for some kind of purposeful, meaningful way. Uh, then last week we talked about the artificial or aesthetic metaphor, something that we were more familiar with. And we talked, so we're kind of clarifying that idea that instead of a kind of expression of language, it basically only reflects as language. It's actually a generative strategy that is analogous to the process that we see in the natural world. So that was kind of where we got to. And one of the things that I kind of think that I'd been struggling with as I first started thinking about these ideas was the idea, is a metaphor foreseeable? And in Bernowski's work, there was a piece where he contrasted algorithmic operations and axiomatic operations with metaphorical operations. And one of the questions I always had was, is a metaphor foreseeable? Now, one of the things that would ultimately give me kind of like a sense of calm or kind of like comfort is the fact that I could establish that in the case of the metaphor, there was a different foreseeability, as was the case in, say, an axiomatic construction, a kind of series of algorithms where, the operations could conceivably be foreseeable as a result of the pieces that were being used. And I came to the conclusion as I've been thinking, and again, this is something that kind of needs more thought, is the fact that the metaphor is foreseeable if you could see all of nature. Is that limited perspective limits foreseeability. So the answer is ultimately at this point, I understand it, yes. The operation of the metaphor is foreseeable in that the result is totally follows from the components, which is kind of like, if I take 2 and 2 and I make 4, the idea is 4 is foreseeable as a result. It has to be an extension of the ideas of 2 and numbers and addition in simple terms. So the thing is, was it when like, we have the idea of like a glass bottle fascination or the cypress that goes to a dead flame, is this completely foreseeable until it is constructed? Possibly, if one could conceivably have all perspectives. But I think the limit of perspective limits the foreseeability. Anyway, so that was what we had come up with. That's what I had come up with. Now, again, let me backtrack. The reason I'm doing this is because these are things I just enjoyed working out for myself, and I enjoyed kind of like looking upon these things and starting to kind of see a kind of like consequence in terms of my own thinking, my own research. I'm an architect and a researcher, and kind of find that these things are kind of things that I've kind of worked through in my own mind. Okay, so this is 22nd of December. It's 3 a.m. New York City time, and the idea now is the unbreakable bonds, or the proto-metaphor, which is a kind of a socio-cultural reality of this idea. So let's see how we think about that, in the fact that, like, there are certain things that exist as things that we can possibly understand in terms of putting things together, in terms of having these things have a consequence in terms of how we live. So some of the examples would be in our um, in our society in the West, we have put together technique and reason, and we have been able to kind of use these things in a way that kind of gives us certain consequence in terms of the things that we create. Now, science and, we think of technology and reason as kind of like, of course that makes sense. Why would technique be related to something else? Well, the thing is, it has been related to other things in other times, and that's what makes it unbreakable. Now, I use the term unbreakable because it's not something that cannot be dismantled. It's just something that I use the term unbreakable because at the moment it shows itself to be of tremendous value, of tremendous consequence. So let's go back to a time when our technique was wedded to something like religion or superstition or something not reason-based. So the warrior who has his sword believes that the blood of his enemies will make his sword stronger because it allows him to embody the souls of these great warriors. We now understand the fact that, like, this was something that was actually a very dangerous belief because it wasn't based on anything, it wasn't provable, and it certainly wasn't true. In fact, some cases, you look at the reality, the treatment of these things, of objects, would actually weaken them rather than strengthen them. So the relationship of technique to superstition, the fact that if I do a silly dance, then the rain will come, and the rain will basically help my crops, rather than trying to understand the cycles of the weather better so I can understand the climate and start to think about how to kind of like maybe better hold on to my water, or better kind of like understand the crops so that I could kind of use the circumstance in a way that was more beneficial to me and be more fruitful. So that's kind of an example of kind of some of the things that would be what we have kind of started to kind of come upon in terms of things that would be of value to us in terms of in that. So these social and cultural things are these things that we've kind of come over time to be able to see as valuable, like the fact that the realm of ideas is free to all. There have been times when the realm of ideas has not been free to all. Is the realm of ideas completely free to all now? No. Is the liberty to engage in exchanging of ideas in a better state of mind, a better state of being than it was at previous times? Yes, I think that probably now there are more people who are capable of engaging and are free to engage in the realm of ideas, and as a result, that there's a value and a consequence that comes from this exchange. So at the same time, the realm of ideas is not for everyone, and I don't say that you have to engage, but I do believe that it's a valuable thing that allows us to kind of like, to kind of look towards these kind of ideas of, exchanging ideas in the hopes that we can kind of continue some of these unbreakable bonds and extending the kind of like civil nature of our existence. I'll talk in detail more about this in the future, but we've spoken about the fact that, in Whitehead, there is this idea that just as the same way that in Darwin, we move to a sense of greater complexity from a simpler level. There's an increase in sophistication and complexity. I think that this is something that also kind of exists in kind of like some of the work, the kind of philosophical writings of Whitehead, especially in it's in process in reality, but again, I can't say I'm a master of that book, but I can say that in terms of, like, the adventures of ideas, he basically, I think, encapsulates these things that he sees within this context of the fact that we have the ability to understand moving towards civilization, moving towards a place where we can be more in the case of sophistication or advancement, and that there is a kind of a necessary belief in the idea of progress, which is different than change. So some of those things, like I said, is this idea of the fact that there is like a connection, currently an unbreakable bond between science and uh, technology, or kind of what I would say in more fundamental terms, technique and reason. Some of the benefits that we gain to that, if it isn't clear, is the fact that as a result of understanding the way to test the things that we believe technically, we can put things to certain scrutinies, and as a result, evaluate the results in terms of the ability to advance performance. So, understanding material science helps us create more efficient weapons, as opposed to believing that all you have to do is kind of like, uh, engage in some kind of superstitious practice with the sacrifice of virgins or burning of witches, or all these kind of, terribly abusive, horrible things that basically not only could not have been proven, or weren't proven, nobody tried to prove them, they just kind of accepted them and never questioned them. So now the ability to kind of question gives, based on a kind of a logical, rational format, allows us to kind of see the idea of the simulation in order to test and improve. Um, so these are one of the things that I think also Ortega Say in Revolt of the Masses talked about, the fact that that consequence of um, putting technique and reason together in this unbreakable bond was something that was of great value to Western society and allowed us to advance quite tremendously. And again, we're not talking about a moral advancement, we're talking about a technological advancement. Our technique has certainly advanced to levels that were not uh, seen previously. I mean, our ability to engineer has certainly been the most advanced that certainly we've ever seen it. The moral question is still out there. I have some friends who we discuss this idea that we are morally more capable, but at the same time, I can't really see ourselves, especially in the context of things like the Nazis and some of the things that have been done in China and Soviet Union, that we, or even in my own country, that show that we are more morally advanced. So I mean, it's the issue still, I think it can be contended. But in terms of certain things, I think there were certain things that certainly had value. I mean, there was a thesis promoted that Darwin's Origin of Species, in that it established the fact that all humans had a common ancestry, went a long way in kind of putting in question a lot of these ideas of prejudice and discrimination. Whereas before, the previous excuse was, this person is not my brother, as opposed to the person is, no, this person is my brother. There's a kinship here that I should not, uh, ignore. So I think that sets good example, but is there kind of like is there a kind of like conclusive moral kind of like advanced establishment? No. I haven't seen it yet. It could be there, but it's not something that I can necessarily see at this point. One of the other things, in terms of disconnection, is that the disconnection comes because you understand the fact that there is either uh, a kind of like an indictment of the society, where certain things start to become uh, retrograde, and there is a kind of dismantling uh, without purposefulness, kind of as a result of losing the understanding of the consequence by which these things exist. One of the reasons I always say is that, like, it's important to argue from principles, not not uh, not from points. I think the idea is that, like, you have an argument, it should basically follow the principles by which that particular position is established. And I think that that's something that I see uh, people will kind of substitute a moral equivalent or some kind of other equivalent, and not necessarily understand the principles that the the idea is based on. So I think that's something that needs to kind of be understood. In fact, I saw something recently where I saw this person who was arguing very poorly for an idea that I deeply believed in, but they were doing such that it reinforced an idea that I've always held, which is much rather have a conversation with someone who has an opposing viewpoint, but has studied it deeply and understands why they have an opposing viewpoint to mine, than someone who simply just coincidentally has come to the same conclusion as I have. And I think that's something that, again, we'll talk about this further episodes about, social indictments. But let's kind of get into some more kind of reasonable um, examples. Um, a kind of simple one for me is one of the things that I think is a and to follow up, I think Diderot understood the fact that the encyclopedia was necessary in order to kind of maintain these principles, so these principles would not vanish when there were temporary lapses of intellect or understanding or appreciation. And I think that, again, is something we need to understand. One of the things I find is a great example of kind of like the Enlightenment is, and I kind of like grew up with this with like Monty Python and the Marx Brothers, is that sarcasm and humor has a very strong link to tolerance. And I think tolerance is something that you want to check in an individual. And I think that you can test an individual's tolerance by how much you can be sarcastic and humorous in terms of their nature, which comes to something we'll talk about next week, which is the necessity of criticism. I believe that that relationship of sarcasm or humor as a test of tolerance is a very valuable unbreakable bond in our society. And it is a good thing to kind of test in terms of, like where we stand, because there is a tremendous amount of resistance to humor and sarcasm. And I kind of find that that's troubling. I find that's an indictment. So that's basically that. I think criticism and reason, reason and progress, liberty and progress. And again, let me make a quick example. Liberty are the rights of individuals within a society. Freedom, and this is my explanation, freedom is an existential consequence of being alive. So, as a result of being alive, you have to choose within the context of your freedom as an individual who lives. Liberty are the things that are given to you by a society that allows you to exercise that freedom. So, in my case, I believe that freedom has to be supported by tremendous appreciation to liberty. So the social aspect has to be there in order to support as best as possible the freedom of the individual, right? To basically do his best within the context that he has to understand his destiny. So these are some of those examples. Next week we'll be talking about criticism, and criticism is something that is a word that I think needs to kind of be evaluated and appreciated within our society. I think it is something that I'll kind of go into later about the fact that it can be an indictment of our society. So there's certain, you can test certain unbreakable bonds in their existence or their kind of like frayed nature as an indictment or kind of like acknowledgement of the potential or the value or the accomplishment of the society in which you live. So these things are kind of are an extension of the idea of the metaphor, of the operation of the metaphor, and we see them as kind of like markers of social health or decay within a society, within a culture. So that's basically a fairly good synopsis of this particular instance, and this kind of like I guess closes up this idea of the operation of the metaphor and its kind of different circumstances in the natural, artificial, and cultural, social, which is again part of the artificial realm. But there's a kind of like the artistic, artificial realm, and then there's the kind of cultural, social. So maybe the realm of the individual, and then again, but there is of course the artistic world in terms of its cultural, social significance, which again is a separate topic, which we will probably hit on sooner or later. But again, this is just kind of setting the ground for the way in which I conduct myself in terms of my research and my own work as an architect and a researcher. So, oh my God, it's 20 minutes already. I have to learn. I don't talk fast, but I need to talk more efficiently, more effectively. But I guess I think also what happens is as you do these things, because there was a previous time when I did this, but I think then I was kind of like sometimes up into like 40, 45 minutes, and that was just too much. Anyway, so this is kind of like wrapping up for that. So that's kind of like where we are. So next week, after Christmas, pre-New Year, the value and necessity of criticism. And then I think after that, the art of finding what needs to be said, and closing up with the view of criticism as an indicator of societal health. So that's the next kind of bracketed three. So that's number 5, number 6, and number 7. And then after that, I think I'm going to go into specifics of architecture, because I think there's enough of a kind of a context here to start to open up the idea of some of the things that I do as an operation. But then we'll kind of get into the reasons. And I think I think next week will be good because I think it's important to appreciate the value of criticism, what it is, what it isn't, and that'll kind of pretty much set out, just like the operation of the metaphor set out the previously to kind of indicate for these 3, and then the next ones will do the same. Okay, so this was enjoyable, as I enjoy doing this. So in closing, I think there'll probably be one. Actually, not thinking that, I'm not sure where I'll put it, but I think I really want to do one on the realm of ideas and why, what that is, why it's important, and why we need to kind of maintain it. Because it is kind of like an unbreakable bond in the fact that it is something that, like, when the realm of ideas is not free to all, and you want to continue to kind of be moving in that direction, it is an indictment of our society, and it is I think the way in which criticism is viewed by society is an indicator of societal health. So let's leave it at that, and we'll look forward to that, and just say in our closing, as usual, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to all of our benefit to keep it just exactly that way. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.